The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty road leading into Jerome, Arizona, and Jacob Grant could see her from half a mile away, struggling with those buckets like her life depended on it. He had been descending from his cabin high in the Mingus Mountains, where he had lived alone for the past 3 years since leaving his family's ranch in Texas. At 28 years old, Jacob stood well over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and arms thick with muscle from years of splitting wood, hauling stone, and surviving in the wilderness. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, usually tied back with a strip of leather, and his jaw was covered with a thick beard that he trimmed only when it became inconvenient. He had come down to Jerome that September day in 1883 to trade furs and restock supplies, not expecting to see anything that would stop him in his tracks. But there she was. The woman could not have been more than 22 or 23, wearing a faded blue dress that had been mended multiple times, her dark blonde hair pinned up in a way that suggested she had done it hastily that morning. She carried 2 wooden buckets filled to the brim with water, one in each hand, and even from a distance, Jacob could see how her arms shook with the effort. She would walk 10 paces, set the buckets down, flex her fingers, pick them up again, and continue. The well she was walking from sat at the edge of town, and she was heading toward a small house that looked to be at least a quarter mile away. Jacob urged his horse forward, the animal's hooves kicking up small clouds of red dust. As he drew closer, he could see the determination etched into the woman's face, the way her teeth worried at her lower lip, the slight wince every time she adjusted her grip. She had set the buckets down again and was rubbing her palms when his shadow fell across her. She looked up sharply, one hand going to shade her eyes against the sun. Jacob dismounted in one smooth motion, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. "Those look mighty heavy for anyone to be carrying alone," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He did not talk to many people up in the mountains. The woman straightened, and he could see her eyes were a striking green, the color of pine needles after rain. There was caution in her gaze, but also a bone-deep weariness that spoke of too many days exactly like this one. "I manage," she said, and her voice had a softness to it despite the defensive edge. "I can see that," Jacob replied, "but managing and having help are 2 different things. Where are you headed with those?" She hesitated, glancing between him and the buckets. Jacob was used to that reaction. He knew what he looked like, a wild man coming down from the mountains, all muscle and leather and untamed hair. But he also knew how to stand in a way that did not threaten, how to keep his voice level and his hands visible. "The house with the blue shutters," she finally said, gesturing down the road. "But I have been doing this for months now. I do not need assistance." "Never said you needed it," Jacob said, already reaching for the buckets. "But I am offering it all the same." Before she could protest, he had lifted both buckets as easily as if they weighed nothing. They were heavy, heavier than they had any right to be, and he felt a flash of anger that anyone would expect this woman to haul them such a distance every day. His jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral as he looked at her. "Lead the way," he said simply. For a moment she just stared at him, something like surprise flickering across her face. Then, with a small nod, she turned and started walking. Jacob fell into step beside her, his horse following behind without needing to be led. "My name is Amelia," she said after they had walked in silence for a minute. "Amelia Jensen." "Jacob Grant," he replied. "I live up in the mountains, come down every few weeks for supplies." "I have seen you before," Amelia said, and when he glanced at her, there was a faint color in her cheeks. "In passing. You are hard to miss." Jacob did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. They continued walking, and he found himself studying her from the corner of his eye. She was pretty, though she looked tired, with shadows under her eyes and a thinness to her frame that suggested she had been working too hard and eating too little. Her dress, though clean and well-mended, had seen better days, and her shoes were worn at the heels. "How many times a day do you make this walk?" he asked. "3," Amelia said. "Sometimes 4, depending on what needs doing. The well by the house ran dry back in June. The town well is the only source now for those of us on this end of Jerome." Jacob did some quick calculations in his head. 3 trips a day, carrying probably 40 pounds of water each time, across a quarter-mile of uneven ground. That was back-breaking work for anyone, let alone a woman of Amelia's size. "Why has no one dug you a new well?" he asked, trying to keep the edge out of his voice. Amelia laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Do you know what it costs to dig a well? I have been saving, but between keeping food on the table and paying what is owed on the house, there is never enough. And the men in town who might do it for less are all working the mines. They say Jerome is going to boom now that the copper is flowing. Everyone wants a piece of it." They reached the house with the blue shutters, and Jacob set the buckets down on the narrow porch. It was a small place, maybe 3 rooms if that, with a roof that looked like it needed patching and a fence that had definitely seen better days. But it was clean, and there were flowers growing in a small garden beside the door, bright spots of yellow and red that someone had tended with care. "Thank you," Amelia said, and she meant it. "That was kind of you." Jacob looked at her, at the grateful tilt of her mouth and the way she was already reaching for the buckets to take them inside. Something in his chest tightened. "How far down is the water table around here?" he asked abruptly. Amelia blinked. "I do not know. Why?" "Because I could dig you a well," Jacob said, the decision forming even as he spoke the words. "A proper one close to your house. Save you all this walking." Her eyes went wide. "I could not ask you to do that. The cost alone you are not asking." "I am offering," Jacob interrupted. "And I do not want your money. I have got time before winter sets in, and I have got the tools and the know-how. Consider it a trade." "A trade for what?" Amelia asked, suspicion and hope warring in her expression. Jacob thought fast. "Home-cooked meals while I am working. I have been eating my own cooking for 3 years, and I am getting tired of it." It was not entirely a lie. His cooking was terrible. But the real reason had more to do with the way Amelia's hands had been shaking when she carried those buckets, and the shadows under her eyes, and the sense that she was a woman who had been managing alone for far too long. Amelia studied him for a long moment, and Jacob had the distinct feeling he was being measured and assessed. Finally, she nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "But proper meals, mind you, not just coffee and biscuits." "Fair enough," Jacob agreed. "When would you start?" "Tomorrow," Jacob said. "I will bring my tools up from where I keep them stored. It will take some time to find the right spot and dig down, but I would say 3 weeks if the ground cooperates." Amelia looked like she wanted to say something else, maybe to protest again or to ask why he was really doing this, but instead she just nodded. "Tomorrow, then. I will have breakfast ready by 7. Jacob tipped his hat to her and swung back up onto his horse. As he rode toward the general store to finish his business in town, he could feel her eyes on his back. He told himself he was just being neighborly, that anyone would do the same. But the truth was, he had ridden past plenty of people struggling with plenty of things over the years, and he had never stopped before. There was something about Amelia Jensen that had gotten under his skin in the span of a single conversation, and Jacob had a feeling his quiet mountain life was about to get a lot more complicated. That night, Jacob camped on the outskirts of Jerome rather than making the long ride back up to his cabin. He lay on his bedroll under a sky full of stars, thinking about green eyes and blue shutters, and the way Amelia had tried so hard to pretend those buckets were not too heavy. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out, and his horse nickered softly in response. He had meant what he said about digging the well. Jacob was a man of his word, always had been. But as he drifted off to sleep, he found himself wondering what Amelia's story was, why she was living alone in that little house, and whether anyone else in Jerome looked after her the way she clearly needed. Morning came with a wash of pink and gold across the sky. Jacob rose before dawn, tended to his horse, and made his way to the livery stable where he kept some of his larger tools stored. The owner, an older man named Pete, raised his eyebrows when Jacob explained what he needed but asked no questions. That was one thing Jacob appreciated about Pete. The man knew when to mind his own business. By the time Jacob reached Amelia's house with his wagon loaded down with picks, shovels, a tripod, buckets, and rope, the sun was just cresting the horizon. He could smell coffee brewing and something that made his stomach growl, something involving bacon and bread and maybe eggs. Amelia appeared in the doorway before he could knock, as if she had been watching for him. She wore a different dress today, this one a pale green that brought out her eyes, and her hair was braided in a long plait down her back. "Good morning," she said, and there was a nervousness to her smile that Jacob found oddly endearing. "I have breakfast ready. I hope you are hungry." "Always," Jacob said truthfully. She led him inside, and Jacob had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe. The interior of the house was as clean and well kept as the exterior, with simple furniture that had been carefully maintained. There was a small table set for two, and the food laid out on it was more than he had expected. Fried eggs, thick slices of bacon, fresh bread with butter and jam, and coffee that smelled like heaven. "This is quite a spread," Jacob said, taking the seat she indicated. "You are going to be doing hard labor," Amelia replied, sitting down across from him. "You will need your strength." They ate in a silence that was only slightly awkward. Jacob was not used to table manners anymore, but he did his best to remember what his mother had taught him years ago. Amelia picked at her food more than she ate it, and he noticed she gave him the larger portions of everything. "So," she said after a while, "where exactly do you think we should dig?" Jacob appreciated the "we." It suggested she was not going to just stand aside and watch, which did not surprise him given what he had already seen of her character. "Need to walk the property," he said. "Look for signs of water. There are ways to tell where the ground will be most forgiving and where the water table is closest to the surface. It is part science, part instinct." "My father used to say something similar about finding water," Amelia said, then her expression shuddered slightly, as if she had revealed more than she intended. "Used to?" Jacob asked gently. "He died 4 years ago," Amelia said, looking down at her plate. "Accident in the mine. My mother followed 6 months later. Her heart, the doctor said, but I think it was more that she did not want to live without him." "I am sorry," Jacob said, and he meant it. He knew what it was like to lose people. Amelia looked up at him, and there was a steadiness in her gaze that spoke of someone who had processed her grief and come out the other side. "Thank you. It was a difficult time, but I have managed. This was their house. I grew up here. It is paid off now or will be in another year. I work at the dress shop in town 3 days a week, and I take in mending. It is enough to get by." Just barely, Jacob thought, but he did not say it out loud. Instead, he finished his coffee and stood. "Should we take a look around then?" They spent the next hour walking Amelia's property, which was larger than Jacob had initially thought, stretching back from the house in a wide rectangle. The land was rocky and red, typical of the Arizona high desert, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional juniper. Jacob studied the vegetation, the way the ground sloped, the color and composition of the soil. "Here," he finally said, stopping at a spot about 30 feet from the back of the house. "This is where we will dig." "How can you tell?" Amelia asked, crouching down to run her fingers through the dirt. "See how the sage grows thicker here, and that cottonwood sapling. Trees like that need water. Their roots go deep, which means there is moisture down below. The ground has a slightly different color too, darker. All signs point to this being a good spot." "I never would have noticed any of that," Amelia said, standing and brushing off her hands. "It takes practice," Jacob said. "Now I will warn you, this is going to be loud and dirty work. If you have got things to do in town, today would be a good day for it." But Amelia shook her head. "No, I want to help. What can I do?" Jacob considered. "Can you handle a bucket and rope?" "Of course." "Then as I dig, I will need you to haul up the dirt. It will get heavier as I go deeper, but if you tell me when it is too much, we can work out a pulley system." "I am stronger than I look," Amelia said with a slight lift of her chin. Jacob did not doubt it. Anyone who had been hauling water buckets 3 times a day for months had to have strength, even if it did not show in obvious ways. They worked through the morning, falling into a rhythm. Jacob stripped off his shirt after the first hour, the Arizona sun beating down on his back as he swung the pick. Sweat poured off him, and his muscles bunched and flexed with each strike into the earth. He was aware of Amelia watching him, though she tried to be subtle about it, and something about her gaze made him want to work harder, dig faster, show her that he could do this thing he had promised. Amelia, for her part, proved to be as capable as she had claimed. She hauled bucket after bucket of dirt and rock, dumping each load in a growing pile away from the well site. Her face grew flushed with the effort, and her braid came loose, strands of hair sticking to her damp forehead, but she never complained. Around noon, she disappeared into the house and came back with a pitcher of water and 2 glasses, along with sandwiches wrapped in cloth. "You need to rest," she said firmly when Jacob looked like he might argue. "Heat stroke is a real danger, and I will not have you collapsing on my property." Jacob could not help but grin at the stubborn set of her jaw. "Yes, madam." They sat in the shade of the house, eating and drinking in companionable silence. Jacob was acutely aware of how close Amelia was sitting, close enough that he could see the faint freckles across her nose and the way her green eyes had flecks of gold in them. She had a small scar on her chin, barely noticeable, and he found himself wondering about its origin. "Why do you live alone in the mountains?" Amelia asked suddenly, and Jacob realized she had caught him staring. He looked away, taking a long drink of water before answering. "Needed to get away from people for a while. Sometimes the world gets too loud, you know. The mountains are quiet, simple. A man knows where he stands. Do you get lonely?" It was a personal question, but Jacob found he did not mind it coming from her. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I have got my horse and I see people when I come to town. It is enough." "Is it?" Amelia asked, and there was something in her voice that made Jacob look at her sharply. "Is what?" "Enough," she said softly. "Is it really enough, or is it just what you have convinced yourself to settle for?" Jacob did not have an answer for that, so he stood and went back to work. The afternoon passed in a blur of swinging picks and hauling buckets. By the time the sun started to sink toward the western horizon, Jacob had dug down about 6 feet, and his arms were screaming in protest. He was strong, yes, but well, digging was brutal work, the kind that tested even the toughest men. "That is enough for today," Amelia called down to him. "Come up before you hurt yourself." Jacob wanted to protest, but he knew she was right. He climbed out of the hole, using the rope ladder he had rigged earlier, and accepted the towel Amelia handed him. He wiped the worst of the sweat and dirt from his face and chest, then pulled his shirt back on despite the fact that it would just get filthy again. "Same time tomorrow?" Amelia asked. "If the offer of breakfast still stands," Jacob said. "It does," she replied, and her smile was warmer than it had been that morning. "Thank you, Jacob, for all of this." "Thank me when there is water coming out of the ground," he said, but he returned her smile. Jacob made camp again that night on the outskirts of town. He was too tired to ride back up to his cabin, and besides, it made more sense to stay close if he was going to be working on the well every day. As he lay under the stars, his body aching in that good way that came from honest work, he thought about Amelia's question. Was living alone in the mountains really enough, or had he just been hiding? The next day followed much the same pattern as the first. Breakfast at 7, then hours of digging while Amelia hauled dirt. They talked more this time, trading stories about their lives. Jacob learned that Amelia had never left Arizona, that she loved to read but rarely had money for new books, that she made most of her own clothes, and was teaching herself to play the piano from a book she had found at the general store. Amelia learned that Jacob had 2 younger sisters back in Texas, that he had left home after a falling out with his father over the family ranch, that he knew how to track almost any animal and could survive in the wilderness for weeks with nothing but a knife and some rope. She learned that his favorite food was apple pie, that he had a scar on his ribs from a run-in with a mountain lion, and that he slept better under the stars than he ever had in a bed. On the 3rd day, Jacob hit rock. It was a layer of dense sandstone that would not yield to the pick no matter how hard he swung. He climbed out of the well, frustration evident on his face. "What is wrong?" Amelia asked, handing him water. "Rock ledge," Jacob said grimly. "I am going to have to blast through it." Amelia paled. "Is that safe?" "Safe enough if you know what you are doing," Jacob assured her. "I will need to ride up to my cabin and get some dynamite, probably be gone most of the day." "Dynamite," Amelia repeated, as if she could not quite believe they were having this conversation. "It is the only way through," Jacob said. "Otherwise, we start over somewhere else and there is no guarantee we would not hit rock again." "All right," Amelia said, though she did not look happy about it. "I trust you." Those 3 words hit Jacob harder than they should have. When was the last time someone had said they trusted him? When was the last time he had given anyone reason to? He rode out within the hour, pushing his horse harder than he normally would. The trail up to his cabin was steep and winding, carved out of the mountainside over years of use. When he finally reached his home, a sturdy log structure with a wide porch and a view that stretched for miles, he felt the strange sensation of being a stranger in his own space. Everything was exactly as he had left it, of course. The furs hanging from the rafters, the simple furniture he had built himself, the enormous stone fireplace that kept the place warm through the brutal mountain winters. But after spending days with Amelia, talking and laughing and working side by side, his cabin felt empty in a way it never had before. Jacob gathered what he needed, including the small supply of dynamite he kept for clearing rock falls on the trail, and made the journey back down. By the time he reached Jerome, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that took his breath away. He expected Amelia to be inside, but she was sitting on her porch waiting for him. She stood as he rode up, relief clear on her face. "I was starting to worry," she said. "It is a long ride," Jacob replied, dismounting. "But I have got what we need. I will set the charges tomorrow morning, give you plenty of warning before I light them. You should probably go into town for a few hours, just to be safe." "I am not leaving you here alone to do something dangerous," Amelia said firmly. "It is not that dangerous," Jacob protested, though that was not entirely true. "Jacob," Amelia said, and the way she said his name made him stop. "I am not leaving. We will take precautions, whatever you think is necessary, but I am staying." Looking into her green eyes, seeing the determination there, Jacob knew there was no point in arguing. "Fine. But you stay well back, behind cover, and you do exactly what I tell you when I tell you. Understood?" "Understood," Amelia agreed. That night, she invited him to stay for dinner, and Jacob found himself sitting at her small table again, eating a stew that was the best thing he had tasted in months. They talked late into the evening, the conversation flowing easily, punctuated by laughter and long, comfortable silences. "Can I ask you something?" Amelia said as Jacob was getting ready to leave. "Sure." "Why did you really stop that first day, when you saw me carrying the water?" Jacob considered his answer carefully. "Because you reminded me of my mother," he said finally. "She used to carry water from the creek to our house every day back before we had a well. It was heavy work, and she never complained, but I could see how it wore on her. I was too young to help much back then, but I am not too young now." It was not the whole truth, but it was true enough. Amelia seemed to sense there was more he was not saying, but she did not push. "Your mother sounds like a strong woman," she said. "She is," Jacob agreed. "You would like her." The words hung in the air between them, implying a future that Jacob had not consciously considered, but that suddenly seemed inevitable. Amelia's cheeks colored slightly, and she smiled. "Perhaps I will meet her someday," she said softly. Jacob left feeling like something fundamental had shifted between them, though he could not have said exactly what. The next morning, Jacob set the charges with Amelia watching from a safe distance. He had done this before, but never with someone he cared about nearby, and his hands were steadier than he expected as he lit the fuse and ran to where Amelia crouched behind a large outcropping of rock. The explosion was loud, a crack that echoed off the mountains and sent birds scattering into the sky. Dust billowed up from the well site, and for a long moment, Jacob could not see anything. Then the air began to clear, and he moved forward cautiously, Amelia right behind him. The rock ledge had shattered, leaving a clear path to dig deeper. Jacob felt a surge of satisfaction as he peered down into the hole. "It worked," Amelia breathed, sounding amazed. "It worked," Jacob confirmed, grinning at her. They spent the rest of that day and the next clearing out the rubble from the blast. It was slower going than the initial digging, each bucket filled with sharp chunks of rock that had to be carefully handled. But Jacob could see they were getting close. The soil at the bottom of the well was damp now, and there was a coolness rising up from below that spoke of water. On the sixth day, Jacob's pick broke through into a void, and water began to seep up from the ground. He let out a whoop of triumph that brought Amelia running. "Is that it?" she called down. "Did we hit water?" "We hit water," Jacob yelled back, laughing. Over the next few days, Jacob built up the walls of the well with stone, making sure they were solid and would not collapse. He installed a proper pump that he had ordered from the general store, the kind with a long handle that would bring water up with just a few strokes. He built a small roof over the well to keep debris out and added a sturdy bucket on a rope as a backup. When it was finally finished, 2.5 weeks after he had started, Jacob stood back and looked at his work with pride. Amelia stood beside him, her eyes shining with tears she was trying not to shed. "Go ahead," Jacob said gently. "Try it out." Amelia stepped forward and worked the pump handle. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a rush and a splash, clear, cold water poured out into the bucket she had positioned below. She laughed, a sound of pure joy, and turned to Jacob. Without thinking, she threw her arms around him, hugging him tight. "Thank you," she said against his chest. "Thank you so much. You have no idea what this means to me." Jacob's arms came up to hold her, and he was struck by how perfectly she fit against him, how right it felt to have her there. He could smell the faint lavender scent of her hair and feel the rapid beat of her heart. "You are welcome," he said, his voice rough, when Amelia pulled back. There was something different in the way she looked at him, something that made Jacob's breath catch. "Will you stay for dinner?" she asked. "A celebration. I would like that," Jacob said, but as they walked back to the house, Jacob knew that something had changed. He had dug the well, completed the task he had set out to do. His reason for coming down from the mountain every day was gone. And yet the thought of riding back up to his cabin, of not seeing Amelia tomorrow, filled him with a hollow ache. Dinner that night was a feast. Amelia had made roast chicken with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread, and a pie made from dried apples that she had been saving. They ate slowly, drawing out the meal, neither of them quite ready for the evening to end. "What will you do now?" Amelia asked as they finished the pie. "Go back to your cabin." "I suppose so," Jacob said, though the words felt wrong. "Unless there is more work you need done around here." It was a transparent excuse, and they both knew it. Amelia smiled, but there was a sadness in it. "The fence could use mending," she said. "And the roof has some loose shingles. But Jacob, I cannot keep you here with tasks I could hire someone in town to do. You have already given me so much." "What if I do not want to go?" Jacob said, the words out before he could think better of them. Amelia's eyes widened. "What?" Jacob set down his fork and looked at her directly. "These past few weeks working here with you have been the best I have had in a long time, maybe ever. I know we have not known each other long, but Amelia, I cannot stop thinking about what you said that first day, about whether living alone is really enough or if I have just been settling." "Jacob," Amelia breathed, but he kept going. "I think I have been settling," he said. "I think I have been hiding up in those mountains, telling myself I was happy when really I was just afraid. Afraid of letting people close, afraid of getting hurt again, afraid of wanting things I did not think I could have. But then I saw you struggling with those buckets, and something in me just knew I had to help. And every day since then, I have wanted to stay a little longer, to find one more reason not to go back up that mountain." "I thought it was just me," Amelia whispered. "I thought I was being foolish, falling for a man I barely knew." Jacob felt his heart leap. "You are falling for me," Amelia laughed, tears spilling down her cheeks. "How could I not? You are the kindest, most capable man I have ever met. You dug me a well, Jacob. You spent weeks doing back-breaking labor for nothing more than some home-cooked meals. You listened to my stories and told me yours, and you made me feel like maybe I did not have to manage everything alone anymore." Jacob was out of his chair and around the table before he consciously decided to move. He cupped Amelia's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "You do not have to do anything alone anymore," he said fiercely. "If you will have me, Amelia Jensen, I want to be by your side. I want to wake up next to you every morning and come home to you every night. I want to fix your fences and patch your roof and carry your water buckets even though you do not need them carried anymore. I want all of it with you." "Yes," Amelia said, her hands coming up to cover his. "Yes, Jacob. I want all of that too." He kissed her then, a soft press of lips that quickly deepened into something more. Amelia tasted like apples and cinnamon, and Jacob felt like he was falling, tumbling head over heels into something vast and terrifying and wonderful. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Amelia laughed shakily. "I suppose you will need to move your things down from the cabin," she said. "I suppose I will," Jacob agreed, grinning like a fool, but he did not go that night. Instead, they sat on the porch together, Amelia tucked against Jacob's side, and talked about the future. About how Jacob could sell some of his land on the mountain but keep the cabin for when they wanted to get away. About how he could find work in Jerome, maybe helping to dig wells for other families, or working as a guide for newcomers to the territory. About how Amelia could keep her job at the dress shop or quit if she wanted, now that there would be two incomes. They talked about children eventually, though they both blushed at that topic. About fixing up the house, about getting married in the little church at the center of town, about building a life together one day at a time. As the stars came out overhead, bright and clear in the high desert sky, Jacob felt a peace settle over him that he had not experienced in years. This was where he was meant to be. Not hiding in the mountains, but here, with this woman who had somehow seen past his rough exterior to the man underneath. "I love you," he said into the quiet night. Amelia turned her face up to his, her eyes soft. "I love you too." They were married 6 weeks later, in October when the air was crisp, and the leaves on the few deciduous trees in Jerome had turned gold. Jacob's mother and sisters made the long journey from Texas, and Jacob was relieved to find that Amelia and his mother got along like they had known each other for years. Several of Amelia's friends from town attended, as well as Pete from the livery stable and Martha from the dress shop. It was a simple ceremony, but it was perfect. Amelia wore a dress she had made herself, a soft cream color that made her skin glow, and she carried wildflowers that Jacob had picked from the mountain that morning. Jacob wore new clothes that Amelia had helped him pick out, though he had refused to cut his hair despite his mother's protests. Amelia had laughed and said she liked it long anyway, running her fingers through it in a way that made him shiver. They spent their wedding night in the house with the blue shutters, now their house, and Jacob was gentle with Amelia, treating her like the precious thing she was. Afterward, lying tangled together in her bed, he felt a completeness he had never known was possible. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. Jacob sold most of his mountain property but kept the cabin and a few acres around it. With the money from the sale, he bought better tools and started advertising his services as a well digger and general handyman. It turned out there was plenty of work in a booming mining town, and Jacob found he liked having a purpose beyond simple survival. Amelia continued to work at the dress shop 3 days a week, partly because she enjoyed it and partly because Martha, the owner, was getting older and needed the help. On the days she did not work, she tended her growing garden now that she had water close at hand, and took in mending from some of the wealthier families in town. Evenings were Jacob's favorite time. He would come home, dusty and tired from whatever job he had been working, and find Amelia in the kitchen or the garden. She would smile at him, that special smile that was only for him, and he would sweep her into his arms, not caring if he got her dirty. They would eat dinner together, talking about their days, and then sit on the porch as the sun set, watching the sky turn colors that never got old. Sometimes they would walk into town, Jacob's hand dwarfing Amelia's as they strolled past the shops and houses. People would call out greetings and Jacob would nod back, still not entirely comfortable with being social but trying for Amelia's sake. Winter came, and with it cold nights when they would huddle close under piles of blankets. Jacob repaired the roof before the first snow, and he made sure there was plenty of firewood stacked beside the house. They made a trip up to the cabin in December, spending a week alone in the mountains, and Amelia fell in love with the place almost as much as Jacob had. "We should come here every year," she said, standing on the porch and looking out at the snow-covered peaks. "Every year," Jacob agreed, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and the news that Amelia was pregnant. Jacob had never been so terrified and so elated at the same time. He became overprotective, hovering around Amelia and trying to do everything for her, until she finally sat him down and explained, in no uncertain terms, that she was growing a baby, not dying, and he needed to let her do things for herself. Jacob tried to back off, he really did, but it was hard when all he wanted was to keep Amelia safe and comfortable. He built a cradle from wood he had been saving, sanding it until it was smooth as silk. Amelia sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her face glowing with happiness. Their son was born in November of 1884, just over a year after Jacob had first seen Amelia struggling with those water buckets. They named him Thomas, after Amelia's father, and Jacob cried when he held his son for the first time, overwhelmed by the tiny, perfect life in his arms. Being a father was harder than Jacob had anticipated, but also more rewarding. Thomas had Amelia's green eyes and Jacob's dark hair, and he was stubborn as a mule from the day he was born. Jacob learned to change diapers and warm bottles, and he walked the floor with Thomas during those long nights when nothing seemed to settle him. Amelia was a natural mother, patient and loving even when she was exhausted. Jacob would often find her in the rocking chair he had made, nursing Thomas and humming softly, and his heart would swell so much it hurt. As Thomas grew from an infant to a toddler, Jacob taught him simple things: how to recognize animal tracks, how to skip stones in the creek, how to be gentle with the chickens Amelia had started raising. Thomas adored his father, following Jacob around the property whenever he was home, his small hand gripping Jacob's much larger one. 2 years after Thomas was born, Amelia gave birth to twin girls. They named them Sarah and Elizabeth, and Jacob was convinced they would be the death of him. If Thomas had been stubborn, the girls were tornadoes into everything and afraid of nothing. But they were also sweet and funny, and they had their father wrapped around their tiny fingers from day one. The house with the blue shutters grew crowded, so Jacob built an addition, adding 2 more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. He was proud of his work, of the home he was creating for his family. Every nail he hammered, every board he cut, was an act of love. Amelia's garden expanded too, and she sold vegetables and flowers in town, adding to their income. Jacob's reputation as a skilled well digger and builder spread, and he had more work than he could handle. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. Years passed in a blur of skinned knees and birthday parties, of Christmases with the house full of laughter and summers spent at the mountain cabin. Thomas grew tall and strong like his father, though he had Amelia's easy way with people. Sarah became fascinated with books and learning, always asking questions Jacob could not answer. Elizabeth loved animals and declared she was going to be a rancher when she grew up. Jacob watched his children grow with a mixture of pride and melancholy. Where had the time gone? It seemed like just yesterday Amelia had been struggling with those water buckets, and now here he was, a husband and father with more blessings than he knew what to do with. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jacob and Amelia left the children with his mother, who had moved to Jerome a few years earlier to be closer to her grandchildren, and rode up to the mountain cabin. It was October again, the same month they had married, and the aspens were turning gold. They spent the weekend like they had when they first married, talking and laughing and remembering. On their last night there, lying in bed with Amelia curled against his side, Jacob said what had been on his mind for days. "I have been thinking about that first day," he said. "When I saw you with those buckets." Amelia murmured sleepily. "What about it?" "I almost did not stop," Jacob admitted. "I had places to be, things to do, and I had learned over the years to keep my head down and mind my own business, but something made me stop. Something told me that if I just rode past, I would regret it for the rest of my life." Amelia propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him in the dim light. "I am glad you stopped," she said softly. "So am I," Jacob replied, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "Best decision I ever made. Building me that well," Amelia teased. "No," Jacob said seriously. "Deciding to stay. Deciding to take a chance on something I did not know I needed. You changed my life, Amelia. You made me realize that being alone was not the same as being at peace. That real strength is not just surviving on your own, but having the courage to let someone else in." Tears shimmered in Amelia's eyes. "You changed my life too," she said. "I was so tired, Jacob. Tired of managing everything by myself. Tired of pretending I was fine when I was barely holding on. And then you appeared, this mountain man who was all muscles and kindness, and you dug me a well. But more than that, you saw me. Really saw me. And you decided I was worth staying for. You are worth everything," Jacob said fiercely, pulling her down for a kiss. They made love then, slow and sweet, reaffirming the connection that had only grown stronger over the years. Afterward, Amelia fell asleep in Jacob's arms, and he lay awake for a while, listening to her breathe and thinking about how lucky he was. He had come to Jerome all those years ago with no intention of changing his life. He had been content in his solitude, or so he had told himself. But then he had seen a woman struggling with a burden too heavy to carry alone, and everything had changed. It had not been the well that mattered, Jacob realized. The well was just a thing, a means to an end. What had mattered was the choice he had made to help, to stay, to open himself up to the possibility of love. And Amelia had made that same choice, trusting a rough stranger with long hair and calloused hands, believing he was more than he appeared to be. Together, they had built something far more important than a well. They had built a life, a family, a future. They had built a love that was strong enough to weather any storm. As Jacob drifted off to sleep, he thought about the inscription he had carved into the wooden cover of Amelia's well, words he had chosen carefully. "For Amelia, whose strength inspired my own. Jacob, October 1883. He had meant it then, and he meant it even more now. Amelia's strength had inspired him to be a better man, a braver man, a man who was not afraid to love with everything he had, and that made all the difference. The years continued to roll by, bringing with them the joys and sorrows that make up a life. Jacob's mother passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 73, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. It was a loss that hit Jacob hard, but he took comfort in knowing she had spent her final years happy, watching her family grow and thrive. Thomas grew into a fine young man, tall and broad-shouldered like his father, with Amelia's quick smile and kind heart. He apprenticed with Jacob, learning the trades of well digging and building, and proved to be a natural. By the time he was 20, Thomas had earned a reputation in his own right, and fathers in Jerome were already eyeing him as a good match for their daughters. Sarah, true to her childhood nature, became a teacher at the Jerome schoolhouse. She was strict but fair, and her students adored her. She married a banker named Michael Roberts, a quiet man who balanced her fierce intelligence with gentle humor. They gave Jacob and Amelia their first grandchild, a boy they named Jacob after his grandfather. Elizabeth did indeed become a rancher, though the path there was not easy for a woman in the 1890s. She fought for every acre, every opportunity, and Jacob could not have been more proud. She married late, at 30, to a rancher named Daniel Foster who saw her as an equal partner. Together, they built one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory. Through it all, Jacob and Amelia were constants in each other's lives. They grew older together, Jacob's dark hair going gray at the temples, and then white, Amelia's face gaining lines that only made her more beautiful in his eyes. His muscles remained strong from years of hard work, though his back ached more than it used to. Amelia moved a bit slower too, her hands stiff with arthritis on cold mornings, but her spirit was as vibrant as ever. They fell into the comfortable rhythms of a long marriage, able to communicate with just a look, finishing each other's sentences, knowing what the other needed before they asked. They still sat on their porch every evening when weather allowed, watching the sunset and holding hands. They still made the trip up to the mountain cabin once a year, even when it became harder to make the journey. The house with the blue shutters, expanded and improved over the years, was always full of grandchildren and later great-grandchildren. Jacob built swings and toys, told stories of the old days, and snuck candy to the little ones when their parents were not looking. Amelia taught the girls to sew and cook, passed on family recipes, and somehow always had time to listen to whatever troubles were weighing on young hearts. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered in Jerome for a celebration. There were more than 30 people crammed into the house and spilling out into the yard, 3 generations of Grants all talking and laughing at once. Jacob stood on the porch, watching the chaos with Amelia beside him, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. "Quite a legacy," Amelia said, reading his thoughts as she so often did. "Our legacy," Jacob corrected, squeezing her hand. "None of this would exist without you." "It takes 2 to build a family," Amelia replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Just like it takes 2 to dig a well." Jacob laughed at that, remembering, "I am pretty sure I did most of the digging." "But I hauled all that dirt," Amelia protested, eyes twinkling. "That should count for something." "It counts for everything," Jacob said, suddenly serious. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "You count for everything, Amelia. Every good thing in my life started the day I decided to carry your water buckets." "And build me a well," Amelia added softly. "And build you a well," Jacob agreed. They kissed then, a soft press of lips that was witnessed by their entire family. The grandchildren giggled, the adults smiled, and someone started clapping. Soon everyone was clapping and cheering, celebrating not just an anniversary but the love that had started it all. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Jacob and Amelia lay in bed together. They had shared this room, this bed, for 4 decades now. It had been the site of passionate nights and gentle mornings, of whispered conversations and comfortable silences. It had been where they had celebrated joys and weathered sorrows. It was, in every sense, the heart of their home. "Jacob," Amelia said into the darkness. "Yes, love. Do you ever regret it? Leaving the mountains, giving up that life?" Jacob considered the question, though he already knew the answer. "Not for a single second," he said firmly. "The mountains are beautiful and I am glad I have our cabin to visit, but a place is just a place. You are home, Amelia. Wherever you are, that is where I want to be." He felt rather than saw her smile in the darkness. "You are home for me too," she whispered. They fell asleep like they had nearly every night for 40 years, wrapped around each other. 2 people who had chosen to build a life together and had never looked back. Jacob was 72 when his health began to fail. His heart, the doctor said, was wearing out after a lifetime of hard work. There was nothing to be done except rest and take things easy, advice that Jacob followed reluctantly, and only because Amelia insisted. He spent his final months in the house he had expanded and improved, surrounded by the family he and Amelia had created. His children visited often, reading to him and keeping him company. His grandchildren came and went, bringing news and noise and life into the quiet house. And Amelia was always there, sitting beside his bed, holding his hand, her presence a comfort beyond words. On a warm spring morning in 1926, 43 years after he had first seen Amelia struggling with those water buckets, Jacob woke to find sunlight streaming through the window. Amelia sat beside him, her white hair gleaming in the light, and she was as beautiful to him as she had been at 22. "Good morning," she said, smiling at him. "Good morning," Jacob replied, his voice rough but steady. "Have I told you today that I love you?" "Not yet," Amelia said, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. "But I never get tired of hearing it." "I love you," Jacob said, putting everything he felt into those 3 words. "More than mountains or sky or anything in this world. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, Amelia Jensen Grant. You made my life worth living." "And you made mine an adventure," Amelia replied, tears streaming down her face now. "You were my hero, Jacob. My mountain man who carried my burdens and built me a well and then stayed to build a life. I could not have asked for a better partner." "I am not afraid," Jacob said, because he could feel it now, the end approaching, and he wanted her to know. "I have lived a good life, a full life. I have no regrets." "I know," Amelia whispered, "but I am going to miss you so much." "Not for too long," Jacob said with a small smile. "I will just be waiting for you wherever we go next, and when you get there I will carry your buckets for you all over again." Amelia laughed through her tears, and it was the last sound Jacob heard as he closed his eyes and let go. His last thought was of a dusty road, a woman struggling with heavy buckets, and the decision to stop and help that had changed everything. Amelia sat with him for a long time after he was gone, holding his hand and remembering. She remembered the first time she had looked up to see a mountain man offering to help her. She remembered the weeks he had spent digging her well, the way his muscles had flexed with each swing of the pick, the sound of his laughter. She remembered their wedding, the birth of their children, the thousands of small moments that had made up a marriage. She remembered, and she was grateful. The funeral was large, befitting a man who had been loved by so many. Thomas spoke, his voice breaking as he talked about the father who had taught him everything. Sarah read a poem she had written. Elizabeth told stories that made people laugh and cry in equal measure. And Amelia sat in the front row, surrounded by her family, and said her own goodbye in the silence of her heart. Life went on as it always does. Amelia lived another 5 years, spending them with her children and grandchildren, passing on the stories of Jacob and their life together. She made sure the well he had dug, now more than 40 years old, was maintained and kept in good repair. It still provided water, just as Jacob had promised it would. On a cool autumn evening in 1931, Amelia sat on her porch one last time, watching the sun set over the mountains. She was 89 years old, and she was tired. Tired in a way that sleep could not fix, in a way that spoke of a life fully lived and a body ready to rest. As the last light faded from the sky, Amelia closed her eyes and thought of Jacob. She thought of his strong hands and his gentle heart, of the way he had looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. She thought of the well he had built and the life they had created together. And then, like slipping into sleep, she let go. Her children found her the next morning, peaceful and still on the porch she had loved. They buried her beside Jacob, in a plot overlooking Jerome and the mountains beyond. On her headstone, Thomas had carved words that Amelia had requested. She taught him that home is not a place but a person. Together, they built a life worth living. The house with the blue shutters passed to Thomas, who raised his own family there. The well that Jacob had dug continued to provide water for generations, a testament to the skill and love that had gone into its creation. And the story of the mountain man and the woman with the heavy buckets became a family legend, passed down through the years, A reminder of how love can start with a simple act of kindness and grow into something that lasts forever. In the end, Jacob and Amelia's legacy was not just the children and grandchildren they left behind, or the house they had filled with love, or even the well that still drew water from deep in the Arizona earth. Their legacy was the truth they had lived, that the strongest foundations are built not of stone or wood, but of kindness, trust, and the courage to love with everything you have. And in Jerome, Arizona, where the mountains meet the sky and the desert stretches out in all directions, that well still stands. Covered now, protected, a piece of history that reminds anyone who sees it of a simpler time when a man's worth was measured by the work of his hands and the love in his heart. The well still stands, and in its way, so do Jacob and Amelia, forever young in the stories told about them, forever together in the legacy they created. A mountain man who saw a woman in need and chose to help. A woman who trusted a stranger and found her soulmate. Two people who built a well, a home, and a love that time could not diminish. Their story ended as all stories must, but the love they shared continues, carried forward in the hearts of those who remember, as permanent and life-giving as the water that still flows from the well Jacob built on that red Arizona earth so many years ago.